Next, let's look at some more advanced effects you might use on your layers. We're going to start with the cutter effect, which is not to be confused with the cutter tool. The cutter effect is basically for creating a mask, like a layer mask that you might find in Photoshop. So as an example, here we have this TV screen. And we've got this panda. And we want to make this panda appear like he's on the TV screen. So to do that, I've got this layer that's going to act as our mask. So just like our other effects, we go to Insert, Effects, Cutter. And then we're going to apply the cutter effect to the panda layer. Let's make sure he's visible. And then let's expand the cutter to look at its properties. So what makes these effects more advanced is they actually involve an additional layer. So it's looking for a matte. And what we're going to use as the matte is that screen mask layer that we had before, the purple one. So I just drag this layer and add it to where it says drop layer here. Now, you can see the panda is being cut off, but it's doing the opposite of what we want it to do. We want it to show inside the mask, not outside of it. So to get that, we just double click the cutter layer and then check inverted. And there we go. Even if we grab the panda and move him around, he's still going to stay masked off because our mask layer isn't moving. Next, I want to go over some really cool advanced effects that might be super useful to you in your animation workflow. So I've got this animation of a bouncing ball. And it looks fine, but it's a little flat. I want to add some shadows and highlights to it. Now I could go in with the stroke tool, draw in the area where I want the shadow to be, create a new color, and then fill that in for the shadow. But that would be a lot of work to do on every frame, and if I wanted to change it, I would have to do it all over again. Fortunately, there's an easier way to do it. If I want to add a shaded area to the ball, I would just go to my effects under Insert and go to Tone. Then I apply that tone effect to the ball. Now let's open this up and look at the properties. We can see that it's looking for a matte, and it says drop layer here. So what I need to do is make a new drawing layer that's going to define the shaded area on the ball. So I'm just going to create a new drawing layer. It could be bitmap or vector. I'm just going to stick with vector. And actually I'm going to call it shading. Then I'm going to drag that layer to the matte property. So now, if I draw something onto this shaded area, I'm just going to grab the brush tool. It doesn't matter what color I use. But if I paint on, you can see everywhere where what I drew overlaps the ball layer, it gets added as a shadow. And if I look at this in render mode, you can see it's adding a slight blur effect to the edge of that shadow. I can control that blur effect here. I can also change the color of the shadow. So if I wanted that shadow to have a little more blue in it, I could bring this up. And if I want to change the intensity of the effect, I can change that here. I like 1. So then all I would have to do is go in and draw in all the shading on this shading layer. I'm going to do that right now. So now our ball has a shadow on it. But let's say we wanted to add a highlight too. Well, to do that, we just come to Insert, Effects, Highlight. Now when you go to add this onto your ball, you're actually going to want to add it after the tone effect. So you can see there's like a chain going down the list here. The tone gets applied to the ball, then the highlight gets applied on top of that. If you try to apply it directly to the ball, it's actually going to have two sort of balls overlapping each other, one with a highlight and one with a tone. If you want to be able to see both, you got to apply them in succession, like this. So this is basically the same deal as tone, only it's going to make it brighter instead of darker. I'm going to create a highlight layer. Then I'm just going to drag that highlight layer to the matte property. And now anything I draw in that highlight layer, again, it doesn't matter what color you're drawing with, it's just taking the transparency value of this layer. So anything I draw on this layer, it's going to turn into a highlight on our ball. I'm just going to go through and add in the highlights to each frame as well. There we go. Now let's look at it in render mode. That looks good, but I'm really not liking that color of the shadow now. Fortunately, it's easy to fix that. We just go to our tone effect, and I'm going to reset that blue value on the color. There, that's way easier than having to go recolor everything. Next, let's look at the whole animation with a render preview. There, that's much more lively than before. But there's still some more we can do. This time we're going to add an effect that we're actually going to animate. I'm going to come up to Insert, Effects, and this time we are going to use that Blur Gaussian. Now I'm going to take that effect, and I'm going to make sure to add it to the end of our effect chain so that it gets applied on top of everything. Now we can't actually see anything yet. Now if we double click this layer, we get its properties. And now the important property that we want to use is the directional property. So you remember the other blur effect just blurred everything in all directions evenly. But with this option, you can blur it in a specific direction at an angle. So let's say I turn up the vertical blurriness. You can see it's giving a sort of motion blur effect as if the ball is moving vertically. If you wanted to change what that angle is, you could do that with this angle property. We actually want it vertical, so we're going to set that back to 0. Now we don't want the ball blurry all the time, only when it's moving at its fastest, which would be this frame about here. I'm actually going to switch back to OpenGL mode so that we can animate faster. So at about this frame where the ball's stretching out anyway, that's where we want the blur to be strongest. So on our Gaussian blur, we're going to add a keyframe at that point. Then let's open this up so we can look at our properties. We want to come back to the beginning and then take down the vertical blurriness to 0. And then at the end, we want the same thing. Let's be sure to add a keyframe. Because I don't have my animate button turned on, I'm adding my keyframes by hand. So we can see at this point it's the blurriest. And then it gets less blurry as it slows down at the top of its bounce. Now we probably also don't want it blurry at this point. So let's click down here and add another keyframe. And then let's bring that blurriness not all the way down, but pretty far down. And actually here, we could even go horizontal with the blur. But then we need to make sure that we set a keyframe for the horizontal blur as well, and make sure that's at 0 on our first and last keyframes. So let's do a render preview and see how that looks. That might be a bit strong. Fortunately, it's easy to change, isn't it? So at that point where it's strongest, let's turn it down to, let's say, 4 or 3. And let's turn this one down as well. The other values are all at 0 anyway, so we don't need to change those. And now let's do another preview. There, that's much more subtle. So that bouncing ball looks pretty good itself. But the next thing that we could use is a shadow on the ground. Let's look at how to do that next. So we want an easy way to put a shadow on the ground that corresponds to our ball bouncing animation. To do that, we're going to use some other Toon Boom features in addition to our effects. we're going to use a clone layer and a quad map. So a clone layer is essentially a copy of another layer that has all the same drawings. So if we right-click on our drawing layer of our ball, we have a couple options here. If we just duplicated the layer, it would duplicate what's there now, but then it would essentially just be a new layer. It wouldn't have any relation to the one you copied from. If we use the first of our clone options here, drawings only, it would make a copy of this drawing layer and all the drawings in it, and whenever we add a new drawing to one of those layers, it would be available in the other one. What we really want though is to clone the drawings and the timing. If we do that, we get this second ball layer, and you can see when I select frames on the first layer, it's also selecting the corresponding frames on the other layer. So any changes I make to this layer are going to get made to that bottom layer as well. Now the advantage of this is that I could move this second layer around and have a copy of our animation in another place. Now you can see when I move that layer, it only moved the drawings that were on that ball layer. The highlights and shading are on a different layer, so they're still over here somewhere. But I'm actually going to remove all those effects anyway, because I don't need them on this copy. So to turn that into a shadow, we go to Insert, Effects, and Shadow. Then if we apply that to that layer, it basically just turns whatever is on that layer into a shadowed area. If we look at it in render mode, you can see it looks like a proper shadow. And it's still following along with our ball. However, it's not running along the ground. In order to make it do that, we're going to use another feature called a quad map. So I'm going to click this plus sign and add a quad map. And then I'm going to take our ball shadow layer and add it to that quad map. So that's now a child of the quad map. Now in order to see the quad map and actually make use of it, we're going to need to do two things. We're going to go to View, Show, and Show Control. And then these are the controls of our quad map. And then we're going to also need to use the Transform tool to actually reposition our quad map. First, I'm actually going to set that drawing layer back to where it was behind the first one. So now it's positioned correctly within our quad map. But now I want to edit the quad map itself. So if I use the Transform tool, I can actually move around the individual points of this rectangle. So if I adjust this so it looks like the shadow is running along the ground, I can even tweak it so that when the ball bounces, it looks like it's moving backwards in perspective. So there we go. That looks pretty good. And if we look at it in render mode, that looks pretty good. But there's one more thing we could do. Let's click the plus on our shadow effect to look at its properties. You can see it has a radius effect too, so that it affects the blurriness of the shape. As the shadow gets further away from the ball, it should be getting more blurry. So at the peak of the bounce, let's add a keyframe. And then where it meets the ball, we'll add another keyframe. And then at the top again, we'll add a third keyframe. So for the top of the bounce, let's turn up the blur quite a bit, and let's check it in render mode. And we might also bring down the intensity as well, say 0.8. So here, it gets lighter and blurrier the farther it gets from the ball. Now we need to do the same to this other end. Now let's do a render preview. So there we go. That's a pretty polished ball bounce animation. We use the tone effect to add that shadow in, and the highlight to add the highlight. Then we use the Gaussian blur effect to give it a motion blur. Then we use the shadow, a cloned layer, and a quad map to create an automatic shadow along the ground. These advanced effects are really fun to work with and can really take your animation to the next level. In the next video, we're going to look at ways that you can save, share, and reuse pieces of art that you create, including animations.